Well, first of all, I find both of them intriguing. Trump's, better known he was president, but RFK is not exactly the Kennedy name is not exactly unknown. I mean, I'll go back to the first election I could vote in was 1972, because at the time the voting age was 21 years old. But in 1968, as a high schooler with no money, a friend of mine and I hitchhiked from Cape May, New Jersey to Camden, New Jersey, a distance of about 80 miles, to hear his father, Robert F. Kennedy, speak. And so, like I said, I'm a 16, 17-year-old hitchhiking to hear RFK. That's how inspired I was by what he was doing at the time.
In this interview, Jim Rickards discusses his fascination with both Donald Trump and Robert F. Kennedy, RFK. He shares a personal anecdote about hitchhiking as a high schooler to hear RFK's father speak in 1968. The conversation delves into the current situation in Ukraine, suggesting that the conflict could have been avoided with a simple phone call from the U.S. to Russia, proposing a deal to keep Ukraine neutral and secure Russian-speaking areas. Rickards emphasizes the importance of acknowledging the consequences of winning wars and keeping territories. Interestingly, he notes that both RFK Jr. and Trump, despite being from different political backgrounds, seem to share a similar perspective on certain issues. The discussion shifts to the significance of the New Hampshire primary in U.S. politics and how RFK Jr.'s decision to run in the primary poses a challenge for the Biden administration, potentially leading to an intriguing political landscape.
It was great. I mean, it was inspiring, and he kind of, he came out of nowhere in the primary because Lyndon Johnson was running for president and Eugene McCarthy was holding his own in New Hampshire, and it was only at that point that RFK jumped in. But that's okay. You gotta pick your spots. Yeah, I've been on that bandwagon for a long time, but RFK Jr. First of all, sorry, the short answer to your question is yes. You could end it with a phone call. This is a war that never should have started. Okay, you could have stopped it with a phone call. Say, okay, Putin, here's the deal. Ukraine's neutral; they're not joining NATO. Autonomy for the Donbass. Stop killing the Russian-speaking part of the population, and maybe a few other bells and whistles, some security guarantees from the EU or NATO, and then that's it. Sign that deal and just go forward and let the politics take its course. So it never should have started. Okay, so then it starts. You could have ended it with a phone call just by saying, okay, got it, you're serious. I should have known that from the start. We'll do the same deal with one big difference, which is Russia will not give up the territory they've taken. They've spent too much money and blood to get there. So you want neutrality, you want no NATO membership, yeah, but we're keeping what we took. Because I always explain, there's so many sort of anti-Semites or anti-Israeli people, you find them in the United States, I'm sure elsewhere, these Palestinians. I keep explaining to them, I said, the Arabs invaded Israel 4 times and Israel won all 4 wars. When you win wars, you get to keep stuff. I mean, that's what war is about. Okay. Oh, get out of the West Bank. Well, no, they fought 4 wars. They won. They're 4-0. The 2006 Hezbollah thing, you can call that a tie if you want. But 1948, 1967, 1973, and the Intifada, they won, and so they get to keep stuff. Well, Russia won, and they're going to keep stuff. That's the difference between pre-war and where we are now. And yes, you could do that deal with a phone call. You just tell Zelensky, you're signing this deal, and we'll let you keep what's left, but that's it. And if you don't, you're gone. So they're right about that. Interesting that Kennedy's a liberal Democrat and Trump's a MAGA Republican, and they think the same thing. That's because they have a certain measure of common sense. But just again, not to get too in the weeds, but I'm coming to you from New Hampshire in the United States. We have the first primary, and there's a footnote there. So historically, New Hampshire is the first primary in the country. It's a bellwether. It's where Eugene McCarthy, by the way, in 1968, he did not win the New Hampshire primary, but he got way more votes than anyone thought, and that led immediately to Lyndon Johnson withdrawing from the race, and then RFK jumped in. But that was the sequence. McCarthy didn't win the New Hampshire primary, but he got like 40% of the vote against a sitting president. That was a shock. Who running for a second term? That was a shock. So, so that's kind of the reputation of New Hampshire. Now, what happened in 2020. Biden finished 5th in the New Hampshire primary. 5th. He slumped out of town. He was written off by the media. Okay, he's done. Let's look at Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Amy Klobuchar. They were the people who finished ahead of Biden in the New Hampshire primary. What happened next? Well, the next primary is South Carolina, which is about 50-50 Republican-Democrat. But if you take the 50% Democrat, that's about 80% African-American. And their boss, their leader, is James Clyburn, who was the number 3 ranking Democrat in the House in the Nancy Pelosi days. And he was going to steer that whole state to Biden because the Democrats were scared to death that Bernie Sanders was going to be the nominee, and he was ahead at that point. So again, we got to flip this to Biden. We don't want Elizabeth Warren; she's nuts. So, but they had to get everyone else out of the way. So the phone calls were made. What happened the day or two before the South Carolina primary? Amy Klobuchar dropped out. Pete Buttigieg dropped out. I think Elizabeth Warren hung on for a few more days, but then she dropped out. Clyburn delivers the South Carolina Democrats to Biden. Biden wins the South Carolina primary after finishing 5th in New Hampshire, and the rest is history. He goes, and Sanders dropped out a few weeks later, and Biden becomes the nominee. So about 6 or 7 months ago, the Democratic National Committee says, well, we're going to change the primary calendar. We're going to say South Carolina goes first. Oh, no kidding. So that's a slam dunk for Biden. They don't want Biden to run in New Hampshire because he's like a sitting president running for re-election, and he might not win, or at least he might be Lyndon Johnson win, but not by enough votes. What they didn't seem to understand is that New Hampshire's status as the first primary state is a state statute. It has nothing to do with the Democratic National Committee or anything else. And again, here in New Hampshire, we have a Republican governor, and both houses of the state legislature are Republican controlled. So they're kind of looking at the DNC. We don't care what you say. We're going to have our primary when we have it. Now, if your guy doesn't want to run, that's up to him. But RFK Jr. says, I'm getting to the point here. RFK Jr. has said, I'm definitely running in the New Hampshire primary. My path to the nomination starts in New Hampshire. So now you've got this awful conundrum for the Biden people. It's like, oh, do we blow off New Hampshire? Well, how does that play out in the general election? You know, it comes down to a couple of votes. New Hampshire's got 3 electoral votes. It's not a lot, but if we're the difference, you know, you've alienated everyone in New Hampshire. How does that look? If you're running for president, you won't run in a primary. So RFK Jr. could win the New Hampshire primary. And by the way, he's polling about 35%, like the Gene McCarthy level in 1968. That's not 3%, which all these other Republicans are. It was Trump's dominating.
Yeah.
RFK is polling around 35%, and if Biden doesn't run, then RFK wins the New Hampshire primary. I defy the U.S. corrupt media to ignore that. I mean, they might try, but then they're just lackeys of the DNC. So it's going to be a crazy year, and I would start there.